We have a action-packed field class, and just word of warning, I hope you have coffee or water or whatever it is, because we will be going over a little bit today because I really want to cover all of this material in depth. And to do that, we're actually going to recap a little bit and look at what we studied last week in a little bit different way, go over those facts again, and then we're going to delve into some new material. And what I hope you see is the overall idea of how Israel's government, how the Torah, the Constitution, and how the character of Yahovah, the way that he judges humanity. We come to understand that because I think God's judgment of mankind is so misunderstood today, probably one of the most misunderstood ideas of God within Judaism and Christianity. And I want to bring us back to a textual basis for God's character, for his judgment, for how he judged. And in that, and this is the incredible thing, in that, we actually begin to understand, it's like this veil is lifted, and we begin to understand why there is suffering in the world. The causes for persecution, the causes for wars, the causes for disease. All of these things we begin to understand by returning to the law and seeing how it is applied in everyday life. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to skedaddle out of here, and don't know any other way to do that other than just got to screen myself off scoot it off the page. So this first part we're going to go through very, very quickly. I'm not going to read this. We've covered this in the past, but I am putting this here because this is the basis of our classes over the next few weeks. This is the covenant of mercy within Israel's Torah, and it really is a family covenant. This is Yahovah's covenants with the families of Israel, and he is revealing to them how he is going to judge them when they disobey. And you'll notice that the mercy in this is that God, one generation does not do something wrong, and Yahovah all of a sudden renders judgment, whether it's disease or whether it is war or putting someone to death or putting them in oppression or a prison. He always waits 3 or 4 generations. Now, again, the 2 houses we are going to be looking at today is going to be Eli's refusal to correct or remove his sons from office and Joab's murder of Abner. These are going to be the 2 specific things. Now, last week we looked at Eli and his sons' iniquity, the fact that they took their office within the priesthood for granted. This idea of kicking at sacrifices, kicking within the Tanakh always refers to rebellion. In Deuteronomy 31 and 32, in the Song of Moses, you have this idea that Jeshurun waxes fat. He gets the benefits, the blessings that Yahovah has for him within the covenant, and then he grows lax in the covenant. He thinks that he has had this of himself. We find that the specific sins of Eli's sons is that they took what was supposed to be for the priests, portions for the priest, as well as the portions that were to be shared with the people. And they took a lot more for themselves and did not leave enough for the people. So just recapping, we saw that Eli was righteous, but he would not discipline his sons. The first generation, Phinehas, was so wicked that he was indeed killed, but he was killed in battle. He was killed in war. Ahitub served under Saul. He is the priest when Jonathan goes and fights against the Philistines. Then you have Ahimelech. He sinned by sharing the holy bread with David. And then you have Abiathar, who rebelled at the end of David's life. He rebelled against both David and then against Solomon as well at the same time. So just to recap very quickly, Ahimelech's sin. The bread that was made in the tabernacle was to be only for the priest. It was hallow bread. It was served with the ram of consecration, and then it was kept in a basket. And it is specifically stated in Exodus 29 that the stranger shall not eat of it. And Jehovah actually has even very stringent regulations as to which members of the priest family can eat this bread. So it's not just even all the members of the family. You had to be in a very ceremonial, pure state to partake of this meal. So it was not something to be taken lightly. Again, in Leviticus, these regulations are elaborated. And the fact that you had to be, in a holy state, even spouses had very specific rules and regulations as to who was eligible and who was not. And it is this idea that when you eat of this bread, it sanctifies you. It sanctifies you to serve before Yahweh, to serve in the temple, and it was restricted, again, only for the priests. So what happened in the course of history is that Eli's house became very lackadaisical with regards to these statutes in the law. They took them for granted. They were not diligent in upholding them. So David, and we're not going to get in this today, but in the latter chapters of Chronicles, which may be very out of place, we learn that Samuel and David had ordered the kingdom. They had set it up. They had put the priests in their offices. They had organized a yearly rotation. So David, after he was anointed by Samuel, it appears he had spent quite a bit of time with the priest. He had a relationship with them and through Samuel. And they had done a lot of ordering the kingdom for how it would look under the future monarchy that would come into play with David. So there was very much affinity between David and the priest. So when he comes to Ahimelech, and he's fleeing from Saul, David does not give Ahimelech, from all appearances, the full story. I mean, we don't know. I am very, very cautious about arguments from silence. I'm going to grab a drink here real quick. I think we have to be very careful with when we say, a text doesn't say something or a text does say something, because we are only given a snippet of information as to what was going on at this particular point in time. So this is just the recorded information that we have regarding these events. David is fleeing from Saul. He comes to Ahimelech, who, from all accounts, sees David as a very righteous person, as the king's loyal son-in-law who is fighting for the kingdom, just like the rest of the nation. And when David comes to him, he's starving. He comes away so quickly. He flees so quickly that he doesn't have time to get any provisions for himself. So he asks the priest, "Do you have any food here that I can eat? Is there anything that I can take with me so me and my men do not starve to death?" Well, Ahimelech, he's very soft. He's very tender towards David, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And he wants to take care of David, but he allows that tenderness of his heart to override the rules of the law that specify who that bread is for. And Ahimelech shares the holy bread, the hallowed bread, the sanctified bread with David and perhaps David's men. We are not told, but that seems to be the implication. So now we kind of see how this has occurred. So we're going to come full circle. What I wanted to do was present the prophecy against Eli's house. So we're going to go back 100 years in time to the man that prophesied against Eli's house. And I just want to reiterate this very, very specific points of this prophecy that occur in 2 Samuel 2, because I think this gives us a better overview. I always find that when you can take a prophecy and you can summarize it. I mean, it's one thing to read it, but so often we read things and it's like, well, what does that really mean? So I think when we can read it, we can say, well, this is what it says, and we can put it point by point. We are much better able to have a walk away with a better overall understanding. So these are the points that we walk away with from the prophecy against Eli's house. And then we're going to look at how these were fulfilled in this same kind of point by point presentation. So number one, Jehovah would cut off an arm of Eli's house and his father's house. I'm not going to read the text. You guys can see those for yourself. By implication, if Eli's house is cut off, well, then naturally an arm of his father's house would also be cut off as well. So it's kind of a lot of times, and this is kind of more of the poetry that you find in Hebrew, where certain points are reiterated, and it is in a much more poetic sense in the Hebrew text. But I think for many scholars that approach this, the poetry, the way things are worded, kind of blinds people to the fact that, hey, there is actually a context. There are actually ideas and specific things that are being said in this text, and often that is overlooked. So that's what I want to keep us on track with today, are the actual concepts. So the second point is no older men would be in his house. So many times we look at the word olam, this idea of forever. When it says that no older men will be in his house, what we see in the fulfillment of this prophecy is that this is actually a very specific point in time where there will be no older men in Eli's house. It's not like throughout history there'll be no old men in your house. Number three, an enemy will be in Jehovah's dwelling. Now we're going to see this more in the second slide, but it's interesting because when you read I think this is 1 Samuel. This is not 2 Samuel. I'm sorry, guys. This is 1 Samuel 2:32. When you read the text in context, it associates this enemy with the wealth of the nation, which is a very interesting point. Number four, this enemy is tied to the loss of the old men in Eli's house. Number five, Eli's men shall be cut off from God's altar. This is a separate point. Number six, the increase of Eli's house will die in the flower of their age. In other words, this is going to take the numbers of Eli's house back maybe to the numbers that they had 3 or 4 generations prior. They're not going to have the growth in the house that they would normally have. Number seven, the sign that all of this would come to pass is that Hophni and Phinehas will be killed in one day. Now, what's interesting in this, I would almost think that the killing of Hophni and Phinehas would actually be the judgment of this prophecy, but it isn't. It's actually just the sign that everything else is going to come to pass. Now, there's a difference. God really looks at things a little bit differently, and you find this throughout the Tanakh regarding blood that is shed during a time of peace versus blood that is shed during a time of war. Those are viewed very, very differently. Wartime is generally viewed as a judgment against a nation in general. And the text does reiterate the idea that, Jehovah will be with certain people. He will protect them in war, but often the nation itself does experience loss. Now, in this case, Hophni and Phinehas are lost because of the fact that they did not uphold their office and they rebelled against Jehovah. They were very selfish and very greedy in executing their office. The eighth point, being cast from their office, Eli's children will beg for food, or they will serve in any capacity within the tabernacle or temple. In other words, right now, the office that they have is really the first office. They have the preeminent position. They are in a place of leadership, a place of authority. While they could come back after they're cast from the priest office, while they can come back and serve, it will be in a very subservient role within the tabernacle or temple, and the implication is that they will not make near as much money as what they make right now. The 9th and 10th points is that Jehovah will replace Eli's house with a different line, and this line will be faithful to him. This new line of priests again will be faithful. And I put on in the quotes right here. You can refer to Moses in Exodus 32:10. After Israel rebelled at the golden calf, Yahweh said, let me destroy them, meaning all of Israel, and I will reestablish my covenants of Israel through you and your offspring and your lineage. And of course, Moses pleads for Israel, and that does not happen. But we do have a situation where Yahweh has already wanted to do this, specifically with the house of Levi. Remember, Levi himself more or less rebelled at the golden calf by building an idol for Israel to worship. So the tribe of Levi is really put in a very precarious position. So now we have the fulfillment of this prophecy in Eli's house. Hophni and Phinehas die when the ark is taken. The sign of the prophecy is fulfilled. Because that sign is fulfilled, all Israel knows that the rest of this prophecy is now going to occur. Phinehas' wife dies in the flower of her youth. Then we have about 100 years later, Ahimelech sins by giving David the holy bread that was meant only for the priests. And then you find that there is indeed an enemy within Yahweh's house. Doeg the Edomite is with Saul, and he is tending Saul's wealth. So he is tending his flocks. He is also administrating the labor of all of the conquered tribes that Israel is having served them. So this is something that nations did when you conquered a people. You would either kill them or you would bring them into service. And Doeg is there as an overseer of many of the servants within the monarchy. Now later on, King Solomon would have this same setup, but it was more of a corvée system, and it was a lot more stringent. And that is where Jeroboam, who later becomes king of Israel, he serves in that capacity under King Solomon. But it appears Doeg served in that capacity for King Saul. So Doeg did indeed have a lot of power. And because of Saul's own iniquities and the division within Israel and Judah, he relied more and more to these foreign principles to secure his interests, even against his own people. And again, that is what we find when Saul orders Doeg to slaughter Ahimelech's house, Eli's house, both young and old, in the city of Nob. Now, notice this did not apply to the entire house. This was just one city where these particular priests lived. Only Abiathar escaped of this particular lineage. But then you find in his old age, it seems that both Joab and Abiathar thought that David was waiting too long to establish an heir, to designate an heir. And they didn't know how much longer David would be around. So they really take the law into their own hands in sanctifying and in coordinating Adonijah in David's old age and in Abiathar's old age. We're going to see today that Abiathar is cast from the priest's office. And then we're also going to see that Zadok in his house displace and replace Abiathar's house. So just a quick look at this. Abiathar joined with Joab in anointing Adonijah, one of David's sons, king over Israel, when David had already promised that right to Solomon. And it's very likely that David had given that right to Solomon simply because of the sin that he had committed with Bathsheba. So to make that right, he sanctified Solomon in that position. Now, it presents a lot of strife in a household when the rightful heir of a house, the firstborn within the sons, is not given the right of rulership. When a younger son is given the right to usurp the rulership from his older siblings. And this again, in this case, produces a lot of strife for David's house. It may have been necessary, but the strife is there nonetheless. So Solomon fulfills this curse against Eli's house when he comes into power. Now remember, this is probably just maybe a few weeks or a few months after Joab and Abiathar had anointed Adonijah. Well, Solomon comes to the throne and he has to sanctify his kingdom. He cannot allow rival factions. He can't allow a coup to occur that could be a threat to his power in securing it over the kingdom. So we're going to read this real quick. This is 1 Kings 2:26 through 27. It says, to Abiathar the priest, the king said, go you to Anathoth, to your own fields, for you are worthy of death. But I will not at this time put you to death, because you bore the ark of YHWH before David my father, and because you have been afflicted in all where my father was afflicted. So Solomon thrust Abiathar from being priest to YHWH, that he might fulfill the word of YHWH, which he spoke concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. So, couple things here. First of all, notice Solomon does not put Abiathar to death, but he mercifully casts him from executing the priest's office. Abiathar is in this fourth generation where this judgment is rendered. Now, the second part of this is that Zadok replaces Abiathar. And the king, this is King Solomon, put Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, in his room over the host, in the room actually of Joab. And Zadok the priest did he put in the room of Abiathar. So now, throughout Israel's history, when you read Kings and Chronicles, you'll find that it's always specified that someone is the son of Zadok. This is very important because only priests from the line of Zadok are now sanctioned to serve in this capacity as far as having the administration over the tabernacle, or later the temple. Now, you did have other priests from other lines. You have Ithamar, and then you have Moses' sons, but they all serve in a subordinate capacity where this line of the chief priest, have the authority over the other priests. Now, just a real quick cap again, we find that, and what we are specifically looking at is this idea of judgment rendering on the third and fourth generation. We've already looked at Phinehas was wicked. He was killed in battle. Hatub served under Saul. Ahimelech sinned by sharing the holy bread. You have Abiathar. Now, one thing that I added here, and this is often overlooked, when David moved the Ark of the Covenant from Abinadab's house with the intention of moving it to Jerusalem, this is really where the priest that should have spoken up, they should have said, hey, David, there's very specific rules that Jehovah have given to us for moving the ark from place to place. Well, nobody spoke up, and because of that, one of Abinadab's sons, likely a Levite, was killed when he reached out to touch the ark. So this is something, it's not necessarily a sin, but it still shows this lackadaisical attitude that the priests had in executing their office. And then finally, Abiathar did rebel, and he's removed from office as priest. Let's go now. I wanted to show this slide to you because, and guys, give me a sound check real quick and just let me know if we are all still good with the feed, just because I have my screen kind of goes in and out at times. So I just want to make sure we're still good. So what I have in this slide is I wanted to show this line of Eli that is cut off. And you'll notice that I also have different names for Eli and for Phinehas, simply because, thank you so much, simply because of the fact that Second Chronicles gives a different lineage. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to say that when there is a judgment against a house or against a person, one thing that Israel's scribes would do is they would render ignominy to a person's name. We see this especially in the case of Jeconiah, who's turned Jeconiah, Coniah, Jehoiakim. All of these techniques in remembering a person and in remembering their acts. When you, oops, I'm sorry, let me go back here real quick. When you remember the person by different names or by a nickname, or maybe by a name that captures the essence of who they were, but not who they were historically by name, it is a process and a tool of judgment that the scribe uses to render ignominy, so that that person's name is blotted out. And this is something that you see over and over again throughout history. Other ancient nations did this as well. You find that this is something that Israel is supposed to do with Amalek. It has not yet been done, but it is something that is a command that Israel will indeed one day follow. So in this case, this is what I reconstructed regarding Eli's house based on Second Chronicles. The other factor that we have is that language does indeed change over time. And the record that we have in Second Chronicles was almost 1,000 years later. So it could be also that the language changed and they did not use the same names to refer to people as they once did. So that is just an overview, and you can see these particular lines that I have in gray is the line of Eli's house. This is the arm that was cut off, and it switches now over to Zadok. So now we're going to get back to this concept of blood guilt, and now we're going to be moving on into new material. I wanted to come back again to the actual concept of blood guilt and reiterate a few points, because this really forms the entire understanding of how YHWH executes judgments within a particular family. But then we are going to also see how he recompenses judgment within an entire nation. And this is key for chapter 17, as we'll be getting back into it here in a couple weeks. So Numbers 35:31. You shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer which is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. Now, satisfaction is where you could pay basically a bribe, and you could, by paying this bribe to the family, your life did not go for life. And that system really allowed for a lot of shenanigans, for a lot of tribal warfare in ancient times, because you would simply knock someone off, give their money a little bit give their family a little bit of money, but it never really reformed that process by which a lot of acts of almost terrorism occurred in the ancient world. So this is a huge reform to this process. Now, I will say that the modern Persian, the modern Islamic world still operates under this idea of paying a satisfaction where murder has occurred, and it does not require the death of the guilty. So again, this literally allows someone to get away with murder. But YHWH's law seeks to prevent that. So continuing on, you shall not pollute the land where you go, for blood defiles the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that sheds it. So what we see is this association between land and the people that live on it. They are very much tied together. Just think of 2 Chronicles 7:14. Go read that again, and notice how closely people and land are really married together. So the only way that a land can be cleansed by blood is by the blood of him that sheds it. The extolation here, the admonition is to defile not the land where you go to possess it, because I live there. For I, Yahweh, deliver or live among the children of Israel. So we're going to just recap a few things regarding the family system. And this again goes to this family system that still operates in the Islamic world today. And these were reforms that Yahweh had made within the law of Moses so that the land did not fall into family squabbles. It did not fall into warfare between tribes. One of the reasons that today we do not have peace in Afghanistan, it's not so much because of the warring Islamic fashions, although that is a key issue, but it's really all of the warring tribes that are family conflicts. They are conflicts between this tribe and whether it's the I think it's the Parshe. So all of those families warring against each other are what keep the instability of the region. But by reforming that system, Yahweh sought to bring peace to the nation of Israel. So I'm just going to go through these really, really quickly. Number one, you find that if a person kills someone, that Yahweh had established cities of refuge for the event and this was protection from the family avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stand before the congregation in judgment. So this is the idea that if someone kills someone, they could flee to the city of refuge. They could have protection until such a time that the case was brought before the congregation for trial. Numbers 35:32, you shall take no satisfaction for him that is fled to the city of his refuge, that he should come again to dwell in the land until the death of the priest. So again, what Numbers is reiterating is that if you have committed murder and you are confined to the city of refuge, you cannot pay this price and get out of the city. Rather, you are to stay there until the death of the high priest. You're not incarcerated in a jail per se, but you are incarcerated within that city. You cannot leave. Deuteronomy 19 verse 6 reiterates this again and kind of gives a little more understanding for the cities of refuge. And it says, lest the avenger of blood pursue the slayer while his heart is hot, and he overtakes him because the way is long, and he slays him, whereas he was not worthy of death, insomuch as he hated him not in pastime. So what Yahweh is doing is providing protection for unintentional murder. Today we would call this as involuntary manslaughter, and it is protecting this person who did not mean to kill someone, but it happened inadvertently. Yahweh protects this person, although there is a consequence and a price he has to pay by being incarcerated within a refuge city. His life is not forfeited. So the question then comes, because the focus of the law is that justice should be served. If somebody kills someone, well, then that person should be put to death. But what happens if that does not happen? What happens when blood guilt is not expiated by the hand of him who shed it? And sorry, this is this particular, there we go. I had a misspelling error there. So what happens when blood guilt still exists within a particular house? Well, let's return to the book of Job for a moment. Remember that you have to be very careful when you read Job to know who is speaking, to know whether it was one of Job's friends or whether it was Job himself. In this case, we are looking at Job's words, which contain much truth. And this is what Job says regarding a household whose sins have not been expiated by the person who commits that particular sin. Job says, "The counsel of the wicked is far from me. How oft is the candle of the wicked put out? And how oft comes their destruction upon him? God distributes sorrows in his anger. They are as stubble before the wind, and as chaff before the storm carries away. God lays up his iniquity for his children. He rewards him. He shall know it. So there's this idea that those children that continue to walk in the ways of their forefathers, they don't turn from those unrighteous paths, their lives will be given in that atonement. At the very least, those sins of the fathers will continue to play out in the lives of the children. So we're just a quick summary. Iniquity, especially blood guilt, should be required by society by the hand of the person that commits the crime. When no justice or expiation occurs, that debt is laid up for a man's wicked children. Now, this again, it's not the righteous children, it is the wicked children. And we're going to get into this more probably about 3 classes from now. Right now, I just want to establish the pattern as we go through these particular case studies. After 3 to 4 generations continue to rebel against YHWH, the payment for justice becomes due as mercy has expired. We're going to look at this in the upcoming lessons with not only individual families, but also within society in general. Justice takes place within the wicked who hate YHWH. It does not take place within the righteous who love him and show it by keeping his commandments. And now we're going to get into another idea. This is Isaiah's words against a particular king of Babylon. And let me go and catch this comment real quick. Miriam says, off topic, how is the solution resolved between women of a tribe or women who feud against another tribe? That's a very good question. I will come back to that after we go through the entire slide. But that is a very good question. I don't know that I have an answer for that, but we can perhaps look at some of the ways things were handled in the past. So for right now, we're going to focus on Isaiah's prophecy of a particular king of Babylon. Now, this prophecy has been misused by a lot of people over time to represent ideas that the scripture do not necessarily support. So notice that this particular prophecy is against a very particular king of Babylon. The prerequisite, or rather the background to this, is the idea that Israel has finally come to a time of peace. All nations are having peace. And when Israel comes to this era of peace, they will take up a song. They will take up a lamentation. They will take up a taunting against a particular person who played an incredible role in their history as a nation. And this is what Israel will one day say. Israel will one day have songs. You know, just like the Beatles have songs, this will actually become a song that someone is going to write one day. And this is what the song will say. But you are cast out of your grave like an abominable branch. So notice this particular person is not buried, and specifically, he is not buried with his forefathers. You shall not be joined with them in burial. So it's interesting throughout, whenever you read through the history of the books of the kings of Judah, you find that one of the ways a king is remembered as being righteous or wicked is whether or not he was buried with his forefathers in burial. And it wasn't just being buried, but how close did they get to the preeminent righteous forefathers in the land. So if they were really righteous, they would be buried next to David and Hezekiah. If they were not so righteous, their sepulchers would be, maybe 20, 30, 40 feet removed, but they'd still be within the garden tombs of the kings of Israel. If they were wicked, they could be buried in the back 40 and nobody really even knows where they're buried. So burial, and again, this remembering the name, was one way that the government had of honoring a person, of giving them a place in history that was credible, that was highly esteemed. And that kept the values of the people strong and who they would extol for having a hand in their history, and who they would denigrate and say, this person, look at what they did to us in our history. So these were very important ways of remembering people. Now, notice why this particular king is being judged, this particular king of Babylon. Because you have destroyed your land, you have slain your own people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. So notice, again, it's this idea that you are not being renowned among your people. Your memory is being denigrated. Prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. For I will rise against them, says YHWH. I will cut off Babylon, the name and remnant, son and nephew, says Yahweh. I will make it a possession for the bittern, a pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, says Yahweh of hosts. So notice that this idea that children are prepared for slaughter. Why? For the iniquity of their fathers, that they continue to pine away in. It's not as though they are looking at what their fathers are doing and they are saying, hey, gang, this just isn't right. We have gone in a direction that is way off course. We are poisoning people. We are, taking people's land away from them. We are killing them if they get in our way. We are manipulating whatever government system there is, and we are taking advantage. We are oppressing people. They're not looking at any of these things. Instead, they are simply continuing in the way of their forefathers. And because of that, that iniquity is laid up for them, and their households bear blood guilt. So in the third and fourth generation, their lives will come due as payment for that sin. And now we're going to go into the third section of our class today. And this is the final section. And again, we are going to be going over a little bit today, simply because of the fact that I really want to cover all of these points in detail. Now, I don't know how to say your name. I don't know if it's Vesley. So if you'll correct me and give me the phonetic pronunciation, that would be great. You say there's a midrash about Hezekiah missed an opportunity to be the Messiah for not singing. That's interesting. I don't know that I've come across that in my studies, but that is very, very interesting. So what I want to look at now, Wesley. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Wesley. So with this, Joab's blood guilt, like the house of Eli, is a great case study for seeing how all of these factors play out in Israel's history. Now, a little bit of background, and I'm not going to read this text. I encourage you to read it on your own. There was a time of war. Absalom had rebelled. There was a coup in the land. And you find that Abner did everything. Now, remember, Abner was Saul's general, the general of Saul's army. Saul had been killed in battle. And at this point in time, there is war between the house of Saul and between David. And I'm sorry, I mentioned Absalom. I don't know that I did here, but if I did, I'm sorry, because that is the wrong context. This is when King Saul, you had the household, you had Saul's house, and the kingdom. David was trying to secure the kingdom, and you had war that had broken out between David's men and between Saul's men. And David's general Joab was pursuing after Abner and his men. And Abner did everything that he could for Joab's brother Ahithophel to turn away from David, or David's men, and from Joab. And he asked him many times to turn aside, and he would not. So in self-defense, Abner slew Ahithophel underneath the fifth rib. And this was during a time of war. There were many people who were killed in this battle because it was an act of war. Well, Joab was very much a man of passion and emotion, a man who was very hot headed, hot tempered, and he did not let things go easily. So, after these wars between the house of Saul and the house of David, after they are completed, there is peace in the land. You find that Joab had come to David, and there's this truce that is being negotiated. Um, Abner is finally willing to bring Saul's house, to bring Saul's kingdom into David's kingdom, to merge the two so that there can be peace and a rejoining between the house of Saul and the house of David. But Joab was not happy with this. It appears Joab was very jealous of Abner. He even questions before David, well, who's going to lead the army? You know, the context there is, are you going to replace me with Abner? You know, how you can't have two chiefs, you know, in the same kitchen. So that is a concern of Joab. But more than anything, Joab ignores the law and all of these protections that have been instituted in the law, where for this idea of the kinsman redeemer, this relative who will go and make things right. And this is usually within the context of killing someone for having killed your relative. The Bible or the Torah does allow for the kinsman redeemer within the concept of buying back a slave and buying someone out of the slavery welfare system, but it disqualifies and it bans the practice where murder is concerned and where slaying someone for the sake of for the blood guilt of that person. But Joab ignores this, and this is what he does. It says, and when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside to the gate to speak with him quietly, and smote him there under the fifth rib, that he died for the blood of Ahithophel his brother. So notice, Joab did this, you know, so that life would go for life, and he did not follow the law. Notice also, he slew Abner under the fifth rib, just as Abner had slain Ahithophel under the fifth rib. So what was Joab's sin? He shed the blood of war in peacetime. You know, things work differently in war, and they work differently in peace, and Joab ignored this. He put David in a very, very precarious situation, because by doing this was an act of treason. It was an act of bad faith. It made David weak before all of Israel in trying to bring the houses together so that they could be peaceful. Joab avenged his brother's death by playing the role of the kinsman redeemer, a system YHWH had reformed. So now we're going to look at David's curse against Joab for murdering Abner. David lays things for Joab and for his house that are very, very specific. This is 2 Samuel 3. This is David's curse. It says, and afterward, when David heard of the murder, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before YHWH forever from the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest upon the head of Joab and all his father's house. Let there not fail from the house of Joab one that has an issue, one that is a leper, or one that leans on a staff, or that falls on the sword, or lacks bread. So you notice there's three key points here with this. And we're going to look at those here in just a minute. So Joab and his brother Abishai slew Abner because he had slain their brother Ahithophel at Gibeon in the battle. So again, this is playing the role of the kinsman's redeemer and requiring this eye for eye, tooth for tooth outside of the system of government and the court systems that had been established by Moses at Mount Sinai. Notice too, we're also going to focus on David. David is adamant. He says, I and my kingdom are guiltless forever. He does not want himself or the people of his land to carry this blood guilt that has occurred by this act of treachery. So there are three things that this curse does. David curses Joab and all his father's house. He puts a curse of disease and lameness. There's also a curse of war, suicide, famine, and poverty that David issues for Joab and his household. Now, the other thing that David does, David is in a very, very precarious position because the people, think of this from the people's perspective. They had met to join the house of Saul and the house of David together. There had been bad blood between them for probably a good 10, maybe 15 years. And how were the people to now trust David and put their trust in him as a leader? So David understands this, and he is just absolutely distraught. So he does something that shows the people how honest he is and reveals his own integrity to the people. And this is what he does. It says, and the king lamented over Abner and said, died Abner as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not put into fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so fell you. And all the people wept again over him. And when all the people came to cause David to eat meat, while it was yet day, David swears, saying, so do God to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down. And the people took notice of it, and it pleased them. And whatsoever the king did pleased the people. For the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not of the king to slay Abner, the son of Ner. One context, a modern context to think of this would be, when JFK was murdered in Dallas. Can you think of, if there were some entity that had wanted him killed, and it was very well known that they were rival factions, and that entity saying, I'm not going to eat or drink, and show his own distraughtness over this death, it helps to build public trust by the fact that you don't take any delight in that person's death, and that you are very sorry and you are very, very humble. So that is what David did regarding Abner's death. And that was one of the things that indeed helped make the transition and this taking of the kingdom from Saul and into David's house. It made it very smooth. Now remember that David showed much kindness to Saul's household. He showed kindness to Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, and he granted them places of honor within his kingdom. And that was a risk that David took, because by doing that, it could have empowered those children of Saul to instigate a coup against him. David ignored those natural precautions, and he showed favor to Saul's house anyway. Now, this becomes a question. So David had issued this curse against Saul's house. There was one way to remove David's curse. A curse not on Saul's house, a curse on Joab's house. There was one way to remove this curse that David had issued on Joab's house. And this comes back to the law again. It was by the hand of him who shed it. So before David's death, this is right after Adonijah had rebelled, and you have Zadok and Benaiah, who have now installed Solomon as king over Israel. And there is probably maybe up to a 2 or 3 year co-regency between David and Saul. They are both reigning at the same time as Solomon, I don't know why I'm saying, I'm sorry guys, I must be tired today. As Solomon and David have this co-regency, maybe the last 2 to 3 years of David's life, And Solomon learns how to manage the kingdom under David's direction. So, towards the end of David's life, he gives Solomon a charge. And he charges Solomon to remove Joab's blood guilt from his household. This is from David and Solomon's house, as well as the overall nation of Israel. So, this, I cannot reiterate how important this charge of David to Solomon, it is just so important. And this is what David charges Solomon. Moreover, you know also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the two captains of the hosts of Israel, unto Abner the son of Ner, and to Amasa the son of Jether, whom he slew. And he slew the blood of war in peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle and about his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet. Do therefore according to your wisdom, and do not let his hoar head go down to the grave in peace. So David is asking Solomon to render judgment against Joab, so that this blood guilt could fall upon the hand of him who shed it, and so it would not live on, causing more strife, more disease, more contention within the kingdom of Israel and Judah as history progresses. This is also important because of the fact that this was an act of war in peace, and this was making of things right. Now the question is, why didn't David just do this? Why didn't David just kill Joab? Because of the fact, why didn't David just kill Joab? Because of the fact that he had committed murder. One of the things that you find is that even though Joab had done that, he had served David faithfully. When Absalom rebels, Joab is still faithful, and he follows after David. He was afflicted in everything that David was afflicted. So it would not have been righteous for David to have executed Joab, because Joab had faithfully served him. They had a history together, and they had a lot of battles that they had fought hand in hand. So that right fell to Solomon. Now, Solomon didn't just go out and put Joab to death. He waited until Solomon himself had cause to put Joab to death. So now you remember that Joab was one of the people that rebelled against Solomon and against David. 1 Kings 2:28. Then tidings came to Joab, for Joab had turned after Adonijah, though he turned not after Absalom. And Joab fled to the tabernacle of YHWH and caught hold of the horns of the altar. So after Joab had rebelled against David and Solomon by following Adonijah, tidings come to him that Solomon is going to put you to death. He is going to make right the sins you have committed throughout your life. So he goes to the tabernacle. He catches hold of the horns of the altar, and he begs and he pleads for mercy because he understands what's going on. He understands how this works. So word comes to Solomon of what Joab has done. He's in he's in the tabernacle, and this is what Solomon says to Benaiah. He says, "Do therefore as he has said, and fall upon him and bury him, that you may take away innocent blood which Joab had shed from me and from my father's house." So this was, again, a very important point. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and read this. This is by the hand of him who shed it. And this is Solomon making things right for the kingdom. It says, "And YHWH shall return his blood upon his own head, who fell upon the two men more righteous and better than he, and slew them with the sword, my father David not knowing thereof it, to wit, Abner the son of Ner, the captain of the host of Israel, and Amasa the son of Jether, captain of the host. Their blood shall therefore return upon the head of Joab, and upon the head of his seed forever. But upon David, and upon his seed, and upon his house, and upon his throne, there shall be peace forever from YHWH. So Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and fell upon him and slew him, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. So notice this whole entire point was securing the kingdom, so there would be peace for David, peace within the monarchy, and there would be peace for Israel. Solomon, and I want to also bring out this point too, that Solomon was very righteous in his judgments. He judged as Elohim. He judged even as YHWH would have judged. So even though Joab had sinned and bore blood guilt, Solomon showed mercy and did not render the death penalty until Joab had openly rebelled against David and Solomon. Same with Abiathar. Abiathar had also rebelled against Solomon, but the king did not put him to death since his house did not bear blood guilt. His family had shown slack in executing the priest's office. Therefore, as YHWH had predicted, Ahimelech's line was cast from the priest's office. So Solomon had judged very, very righteously. So I'm going to go ahead and catch some of these comments that you guys have. This is the end of the class that we're going to go through today. Let me see if I can bring myself back in here. All right, I'm back. So what you have here is you have this idea. Oh, hold on just a minute. Hey, Ethan. Okay. So my daughter just showed up, so I'm going to cut the class a little short here and maybe catch some of these comments later. One of the things that you find is that we're going to see over and over again is that these are not the only two examples that we have. Eli's house and Joab's house are great examples, but we're also going to see how this plays out in Israel's history. Now let me catch Miriam's comment over here. Seeing all the sins of YHWH in YHWH's people, in particular, in no particular time or season, they do not differ in other times. I can see only because YHWH has great chesed of his people. Appeal to YHWH for his great mercy and loving kindness in these times, for he is our only Savior. Absolutely, he is our only Savior. And thank you so much for that comment. And we are going to see mercy in this, not just judgment, but mercy time and time again, and just how long YHWH's mercy lasts. So I hate to cut out of here early, but I am going to do that because my daughter just came to visit me. So I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for being with us. And next week, we are going to be looking more in depth at the house of David and seeing how YHWH's mercy and his judgment plays throughout Israel's history within the house of David. So thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.